The old man's hands shook as he threw his Purple Heart into the trash. Nobody knew why Frank Williams was destroying his only proof of honor, until one young caregiver discovered the truth that would change everything. Frank Williams sat in room 312 of Sunset Manor nursing home, staring at the collection of military medals spread across his weathered oak desk. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Vietnam Service Medal. Each piece of metal carried the weight of memories that had haunted him for 53 years. His arthritic fingers traced the edges of the Purple Heart, and with a sudden movement that surprised even himself, he tossed it into the wastebasket beside his bed. "There," he whispered to the empty room. "One down." The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Frank had been a resident of Sunset Manor for 3 years now, ever since his emphysema had made living alone impossible. His children lived across the country, too busy with their own lives to visit more than twice a year, Christmas and his birthday, if he was lucky. But what Frank didn't know was that his past was about to walk through his door in the form of a 24-year-old caregiver named Sarah Martinez. Sarah Martinez had just started her job at Sunset Manor the previous week. Fresh out of nursing school, she was eager to make a difference in the lives of the elderly residents. Her supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, had warned her about Frank Williams. "Room 312, Mrs. Henderson had said, with a sigh. "Frank's difficult. Refuses most help, doesn't want to socialize, and lately he's been acting strange. The cleaning lady found military medals in his trash yesterday. We put them back on his desk, but—" She shrugged. "Just be patient with him." Sarah knocked gently on Frank's door that Tuesday morning, balancing a breakfast tray in her hands. "Mr. Williams, I'm Sarah, your new caregiver." "Don't want breakfast," came the gruff reply from inside. "I brought your medications, too. You really should—" "Leave them by the door." Sarah hesitated. Through the crack under the door, she could see Frank's shadow moving around the room. She heard the distinct sound of something hitting the bottom of a trash can. What she heard next would be the first clue to unraveling a 53-year secret. "Damn medals," Frank muttered. "Should have thrown you away years ago." Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. She pushed open the door just enough to peek inside. Frank was standing by his desk, holding what looked like a Bronze Star. As she watched, he tossed it into the wastebasket with the others. "Mr. Williams!" Sarah entered the room fully. "Are you okay?" Frank turned, his weathered face showing embarrassment at being caught. "Fine, just cleaning house." Sarah's eyes moved to the trash can where she could see the glint of metal among the tissues and candy wrappers. "Those look like military medals. Are you sure you want to throw them away?" "They're mine to throw away," Frank said defensively. "Did my time, paid my dues, don't need reminders anymore." Sarah set the breakfast tray on his bedside table and studied the old man's face. There was something in his eyes, not just sadness, but a deep, bone-weary guilt that she recognized. Her grandfather had the same look sometimes when he talked about the war. "Were you in Vietnam?" she asked softly. "Yeah, 1968 to 1970. 1st Infantry Division." "My grandfather served in Korea," Sarah said, hoping to establish some connection. "He used to say the medals weren't about the war, they were about the people you served with." Frank's expression changed suddenly, his eyes focusing on Sarah with an intensity that made her take a step back. "What did you say your name was?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah Martinez." Frank sank into his chair as if his legs had given out. "Martinez. What was your grandfather's name?" "Luis Martinez. Why?" Frank's hands began to shake. He stared at Sarah as if seeing a ghost. "Luis Martinez from El Paso?" Sarah nodded, confused. "Yes, but how did you—"
Jesus Christ, you're Elena's granddaughter. The breakfast tray slipped from Sarah's hands, crashing to the floor as she realized this stranger somehow knew her family. "How do you know my grandmother's name?" Sarah demanded, her heart racing. Frank couldn't speak. He reached into his desk drawer with trembling hands and pulled out a faded photograph. He handed it to Sarah, and she gasped. The photo showed two young soldiers in Vietnam-era uniforms, their arms around each other's shoulders. One was clearly a much younger Frank Williams. The other— "That's my grandfather," Sarah whispered. "But he died when I was 5. He never talked much about Vietnam." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "Luis was my best friend. We served together in the 1st Infantry. He saved my life more times than I can count." Sarah sat down hard on Frank's bed, staring at the photograph. "He never mentioned you. He never talked about the war at all." "He wouldn't have," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "What happened over there? What we had to do? Luis was a good man, better than me. He came home and tried to forget. I came home and couldn't forget anything." But Frank wasn't telling the whole truth yet, and the real reason he was throwing away his medals was about to surface. "Mr. Williams," Sarah said carefully, "why are you throwing away your medals now, after all these years?" Frank was quiet for a long time. Finally, he pulled another photograph from his drawer, this one more recent, a family portrait. Sarah recognized it immediately as one of her family photos, the kind that got printed in the local newspaper when someone died. "I saw this in the El Paso Times 2 years ago," Frank said quietly. "Luis's obituary. It mentioned his surviving family, his daughter Maria and granddaughter Sarah Martinez, both living in El Paso." Sarah's breath caught. "You've known who I was since I started working here?" Frank nodded, miserably. "When I heard there was a new caregiver named Sarah Martinez from El Paso, I knew it had to be you. Luis's little granddaughter, all grown up." The room fell silent except for the sound of Frank's labored breathing and Sarah's racing heart. "I don't understand," Sarah said. "If you knew who I was, why didn't you say anything? Why are you throwing away your medals?" Frank stood up and walked to the window, his back to Sarah. "Because I don't deserve them. Not when Luis never got the recognition he should have received." "What do you mean?" Frank's shoulders sagged. "Your grandfather should have gotten the Medal of Honor. What he did, it should have been him getting the medals, not me." Sarah stood up, moving closer. "What are you talking about? What happened?" Frank turned around, and Sarah saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "It was May 15th, 1969. We were on patrol near Cu Chi. Our platoon walked into an ambush. 27 guys, surrounded by North Vietnamese forces. We were pinned down for hours. Half our unit was wounded or dead." Frank's voice grew stronger as he continued, lost in the memory. "I was hit in the leg, couldn't move. The enemy was closing in, and our lieutenant ordered a retreat. Everyone was falling back to the extraction point, but I was stuck behind enemy lines with 2 other wounded soldiers." Sarah sat back down, completely absorbed in the story. "Luis could have made it to the extraction point safely. Hell, he should have. But when he realized I wasn't with the group, he came back. Alone."
Frank paused, struggling with the weight of his next words. "Your grandfather crawled through enemy fire for 300 yards to reach us." 300 yards, Sarah, through machine gun fire and mortar shells. When he got to us, he realized there was no way to carry all 3 of us wounded soldiers back at once. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "What did he do?" "He made 3 trips," Frank said, his voice breaking. 3 separate trips through that hellfire. First, he carried Private Johnson to safety. Then he came back for Corporal Davis. By the time he came back for me the third time, he'd been hit twice, once in the shoulder, once in the side. Frank walked back to his desk and picked up the Purple Heart from the trash. But he still carried me to safety. All 3 of us lived because of Luis Martinez. And what did he get for it? A Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, same as me. But I got my medals for being in the right place at the right time. He got his for being the bravest man I ever knew. Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she heard about her grandfather's heroism for the first time. "But that's not even the whole story," Frank continued, his voice barely audible. "Our lieutenant wrote up the incident report. He wanted to recommend Luis for the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition possible. But there was paperwork to be filed, witnesses to interview, commanders to convince." Frank sat back down, looking older than his 78 years. Luis didn't want any recognition. He just wanted to go home to his wife and daughter, your mother. He'd already been in Vietnam for 18 months, longer than most. All he cared about was getting back to Texas. "So what happened to the recommendation?" Sarah asked. Frank's next words would reveal the guilt that had been eating at him for over 50 years. "Our lieutenant was killed in action 2 weeks later. The paperwork got lost in the chaos of war. By the time anyone thought to follow up on it, Luis was already stateside, and I was transferred to a different unit." Frank stood up and pulled all of his remaining medals from the desk drawer. "I should have fought for him to get that recognition. I should have written letters, made phone calls, done something. Instead, I came home, started a family, got a job at the Ford plant, and tried to forget." He held the medals out to Sarah. "These belong to your grandfather's memory, not to me. I was just along for the ride. Luis was the real hero." Sarah stared at the medals through her tears. "Mr. Williams, Frank, my grandfather never told us any of this. We just knew he served, but he never talked about it." "That was Luis," Frank said with a sad smile. "He used to say, 'Frank, we all did what we had to do. No point in making a big deal about it.'" But Sarah was about to discover there was even more to the story. "Frank," she said slowly, "how did you end up here, in El Paso? This is over 1,000 miles from where you lived." Frank looked uncomfortable. "After I retired from Ford, my wife passed away. Cancer. My kids moved to California for their jobs. I was alone in Detroit, and my emphysema was getting worse." He paused, looking out the window. "I saw Luis's obituary online and found out that he died of heart complications. It mentioned that his family was struggling with medical bills and that donations could be made to help his widow, Maria." "The anonymous donations," Sarah gasped. "Someone paid off my grandmother's medical bills and the funeral costs. We never found out who it was." Frank nodded. "I sold my house in Detroit and used most of the money to pay off those bills. There was enough left over for me to move down here to El Paso. I wanted to be close to Luis's family, even if I couldn't bring myself to actually make contact." The full picture was finally becoming clear to Sarah. "You gave up everything," she whispered. "Your home, your savings. You moved to El Paso just to help our family and be near my grandfather's memory." "It wasn't enough," Frank said firmly. "It could never be enough. Luis saved my life, and I spent 50 years living with the knowledge that he never got the recognition he deserved." Sarah stood up and walked over to Frank. Without a word, she began gathering the medals from where he'd scattered them on the desk. "What are you doing?" Frank asked. "These medals," Sarah said, holding them carefully, "represent both of your service. My grandfather wouldn't want you to throw them away." Frank shook his head. "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand," Sarah interrupted, her voice strong and clear.
My grandfather died 2 years ago, but you're still here. You still have the chance to honor his memory properly." Sarah pulled out her phone and began typing. "What's the name of the lieutenant who wanted to recommend my grandfather for the Medal of Honor?" "Lieutenant Thomas Morrison, but Sarah, he died in 1969. The paperwork is long gone. It's too late." "It's never too late," Sarah said firmly, still typing on her phone. "I'm contacting the Veterans Administration. There are processes for reviewing historical medal recommendations, especially when there are surviving witnesses." Frank stared in shock at her. "You want to pursue this?" Sarah looked up from her phone, her eyes blazing with determination. "Frank Williams, you've spent 53 years feeling guilty about something that wasn't your fault. The war was chaos. Paperwork got lost. But you survived for a reason, and I think that reason is sitting right here in this room." Sarah sat back down beside Frank and took his weathered hands in hers. "You came to El Paso not just to help our family, but because somewhere in your heart you knew you weren't done honoring my grandfather's memory." Frank's eyes filled with tears again. "But what if nothing comes of it? What if they say too much time has passed?" "Then we'll have tried," Sarah said simply, "and my grandfather would be proud of that effort. But Frank, I think you're underestimating the power of a living witness who was there."
Over the next few weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Sarah had convinced Frank to let her contact a veterans advocacy group that specialized in historical medal recommendations. The group was immediately interested in Luis Martinez's story, especially with Frank Williams as a first-hand witness. Frank began spending hours each day writing down everything he remembered about May 15th, 1969. Sarah would sit with him, taking notes and asking questions. For the first time in years, Frank felt like he had a purpose. "You know," Frank said one afternoon as they worked on his witness statement, "Luis used to talk about you all the time. He had pictures of your mother when she was little, and later pictures of you as a baby." Sarah looked up from her laptop. "Really?" "Oh, yeah. He was so proud to be a grandfather. He used to say, 'Frank, someday that little girl is going to change the world.'" I guess he was right. But the most surprising development was yet to come. 3 weeks after Sarah had submitted Frank's witness statement, she received a phone call from Colonel Patricia Rodriguez from the Army Human Resources Command. "Miss Martinez," Colonel Rodriguez said, "we've reviewed Mr. Williams' statement about your grandfather's actions in Vietnam. We're prepared to move forward with a posthumous Medal of Honor recommendation, but we need to meet with Mr. Williams in person." Sarah nearly dropped the phone. "You mean it's actually possible?" "More than possible. Mr. Williams' account is incredibly detailed and matches perfectly with other historical records we found. The Army takes these historical reviews very seriously, especially when we have credible witnesses." Sarah ran down the hall to Frank's room, bursting through the door with tears of joy streaming down her face. "Frank, they want to interview you. The Army is seriously considering awarding my grandfather the Medal of Honor." Frank stood up so quickly he knocked over his chair. Is this really happening?" "They're sending a colonel to interview you next week." "Frank, this is really happening." Frank began to cry, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy instead of guilt. Luis is going to get his medal. After all these years, he's going to get the recognition he deserved. Sarah hugged the old man tightly. "We're going to make sure everyone knows what kind of hero Luis Martinez was." 6 months later, on a crisp November morning, Frank Williams stood in the rose garden behind Sunset Manor wearing his best suit and all of his military medals. The ceremony was small but dignified. Colonel Patricia Rodriguez had driven down from San Antonio to present the Medal of Honor posthumously to the Martinez family. Sarah's mother, Maria, had flown in from El Paso, along with several cousins and family friends.
But the most important person there was Frank Williams, standing as straight as his arthritis would allow, finally free of the guilt that had haunted him for over 50 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Rodriguez began, "we are gathered here today to right a historical wrong. Sergeant Luis Martinez displayed extraordinary heroism on May 15, 1969, saving the lives of 3 fellow soldiers under enemy fire. Thanks to the dedication of his granddaughter Sarah and the testimony of his battle buddy, Frank Williams, Sergeant Martinez is finally receiving the recognition he earned." As Colonel Rodriguez read the citation, Frank felt 53 years of weight lift from his shoulders. After the ceremony, as the family gathered for photos, Sarah's mother Maria approached Frank. "Mr. Williams," she said softly, "my father mentioned you once. He said he served with a good man named Frank who became like a brother to him." Frank's eyes filled with tears. "Your father was the best man I ever knew, Maria. I just wish I'd found your family sooner." Maria smiled and placed a hand on Frank's arm. "You found us exactly when you were supposed to. My father always believed things happened for a reason." As the sun set over El Paso that evening, Frank Williams sat in his room at Sunset Manor, but he wasn't alone anymore. Sarah had brought the Medal of Honor to show him one more time before it went to the Martinez family. Frank held the medal carefully, finally at peace. "You know what, Louise?" Frank said to the photograph on his desk. "Your granddaughter really did change the world. At least, she changed mine." Sarah smiled from the doorway. "My grandfather would have been proud of both of us." Frank looked up at the young woman who had become like a granddaughter to him. "I spent 50 years thinking I didn't deserve these medals. Now I realize they weren't about what I deserved. They were about carrying on your grandfather's legacy."
The room fell quiet for a moment as both Frank and Sarah contemplated the journey that had brought them together. "Frank," Sarah said finally, "I've been accepted to a master's program to become a Veterans Affairs counselor. I want to help other veterans like you who are carrying invisible burdens." Frank beamed with pride. "Luis would be so proud of you, Sarah. You've got his heart, always putting others first." Sarah hugged the old man who had become such an important part of her life. "And you've got his courage, Frank. It took courage to tell me the truth, and it took courage to help me get him the recognition he deserved." As Frank Williams prepared for bed that night, he looked at his military medals one last time before carefully placing them back on his desk. For the first time in over 50 years, he felt worthy of wearing them, not because of what he had done in Vietnam, but because of what he and Sarah had accomplished together, ensuring that true heroism was never forgotten, no matter how many years had passed. The forgotten veteran had found his purpose again, and in doing so had given a young woman the greatest gift of all, the true story of her grandfather's heroism.